I'm personally excited about the next speaker who's coming online with us. Her name is Katharine Hayhoe, and I've heard her speak before, and I'm really excited about this. She's an atmospheric scientist who studies climate change. She's an expert reviewer for the Nobel Peace Prize-winning Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and her life's work has been dedicated to discovering and communicating the realities of a changing climate to those who will be most affected by it. As an associate professor in the Department of Political Science and director of Climate Science Center at Texas Tech University, Katharine develops new ways to quantify the potential impacts of human activities at the regional scale. Together with her husband, Andrew Farley, lead teaching pastor of Ecclesia, she wrote A Climate for Change, Global Warming Facts for Faith-Based Decisions. I want to reread that title. It's called A Climate for Change, Global Warming Facts for Faith-Based Decisions, a book that untangles the complex science and tackles many long-held misconceptions about global warming. Her work as a climate change evangelist has been featured in the PBS documentary series, The Secret Life of Scientists, and in articles including True Believer that appeared in On Earth magazine in 2012, and Spreading the Global Warming Gospel that appeared in the LA Times in 2007. In 2012, she was named one of Christianity Today's 50 Women to Watch. Dr. Hayhoe sits on the advisory board for Citizens Climate Lobby. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Hayhoe. Welcome.
Thank you. Can everybody hear me? Okay, I can hear you and I can see you too. Thank you for that introduction. What that introduction failed to mention, though, is that I am from Toronto. I grew up in Etobicoke. I went to U of T, and it wasn't until I moved to the States for grad school that I ever even met anybody who didn't think climate change was real. And then I married him before I found out that that was what he thought. So I had my very own personal introduction to the differences between Canada and the US and how those relate to climate change. And since then, I did my graduate work at University of Illinois, and then I came back to Toronto and I worked with Natural Resources Canada, with Environment Canada for a while, and then I moved back down to the States when I got married. Because here in Canada we have that lovely thing where if you're an academic and you're not Canadian and the Canadian applies for the job, they get it first. So my husband wasn't able to get a job in Canada. So interestingly, we ended up not just down in the States, but we ended up in another different country, which is Texas. And Texas is really unique in that it has a very unique culture and it has very unique perspectives on things. And so it's been really interesting finding myself as a transplanted Canadian down in Texas talking to people about climate change in a place where the latest polls as of last summer say that I think over 60% of people in Texas do not think that humans are causing climate change. And honestly, if you left Austin out of the picture, Austin being the place where everybody moves who doesn't want to be in Texas, if you left Austin out, I think you'd probably get more like 70 or 80%. So I want to share with you a couple of thoughts on how I talk to people about climate change. Recognizing that the people that we talk to everywhere have different perspectives, they're coming from different places, but people are people. So I'm going to try to share my screen with you, and let's see if you can see it. I'm going to share my desktop. Okay. And then I'm going to make this go full screen. All right. Can everybody see this pretty picture? Yes. Okay, good. This is a picture. This is the picture that most shocked me this year. This is a poll of people in the US, and it shows what most divides people based on whether they're a Democrat or a Republican. Now, in the U.S., of course, there's only two political parties, and I think that accounts for a lot of the issues that people have. Now, the number one issue is, do you approve of the president? And that should be the number one issue, right? Because otherwise, why are you a certain political party, right? The number two issue is climate change. And then you have gun control, and then you have, do you trust scientists? And then you have the Arctic and weather. Equally shocking to me was the fact that when people have surveyed the accuracy of information on major news networks like CNN, last year 30% of the information on CNN was false. And this is something that my colleague Max Boykoff calls balance as bias, because often people in the media think that we have to present both sides. The problem is, when one side is false and the other side is true, that means that whenever you present both sides, you're presenting 50% false information. Now, this is CNN, and up in Canada, we didn't used to get other networks, but nowadays we do get other networks. And when you look at other networks, the situation is even worse. So when we talk about climate change, this is the process that I go through. Now, just a reality check here. Are you still seeing the slides? Yes, okay, good. Thank you. When I talk about climate change, then, we have to recognize it's not necessarily about providing people with information. It's more about connecting that information with the values that people already have. So I very consciously, whether I'm talking to an individual or a group, I consciously think about what do I have in common with whoever it is that I'm talking to, in addition to both of us being human. And then I try to connect that value that I have, that I share with whoever I'm talking to, I try to connect that value to the issue of climate change. Only then do I actually say, here's what climate change is doing. That's when I get to climate change. And then I go back and I say, what can we do that you and I would both get excited about given the values that we have? And I found this to be really effective because we're connecting not from up here, but we're connecting from down here. And that makes a world of difference, connecting from the heart versus connecting from the head. So who is my audience? Well, you know, it could be people who enjoy skiing. Or it could be people who enjoy fishing. When I was young, I used to be known as the scourge of the Great Lakes. I would fish every day from 6 a.m. till 10 a.m., from June to August. It could be something as simple as working with other people who have children, because there's nothing that we love more than our kids, and we would do anything for our kids. And that's why I think groups like the Moms Clean Air Force or Climate Parents are so important. It's because it's putting this issue squarely in the context of our kids. Our faith communities are a great place to look to see who we have common values with. And then, lastly, who is not the people we want to connect with? And often, there aren't that many people like this, but there are people who are very stridently opposed to saying that climate change is real. And sometimes, more as scientists, I think, than as CCLers, sometimes we feel like, oh, well, we should be responding to those people to show them that they're wrong. But the truth of the matter is, those are not the type of people whose mind we're going to change. We're going to change people who we're able to connect with. So I often use this perspective when I'm thinking about people, and I have not seen this survey done for Canada, and I'd be very curious where we Canadians fall, because this is just my guess, but I would guess that if you surveyed Canadians, we would probably have a lot more people in the cautious and the disengaged groups, and I think we would have less people in the doubtful and dismissive groups. But even still, even in the US, there's still a fair amount of people who are cautious and concerned. So the way I think of my goal when I talk to an individual person, or again when I talk to a group of people, is I'd really just want to move people one step up the ladder. So we don't have to turn the world into alarmed people. We want people to be concerned, or even cautious, or alarmed, but we don't want them to be disengaged, doubtful, or dismissive. So if I can take someone who is disengaged and I can connect the issue of climate change to something they care about so that they engage, I can move them into cautious or even concerned. So who is my audience? I'm just going to give you some examples. So, you say, well, that might sound fine, but what does this really mean to do? Well, I have two very interesting audiences, two very unique audiences. My first audience are Texans, because that's where I live. So when I talk to Texans, and this is a picture of what it looks like where I live, when I talk to Texans, Texans are very familiar with natural variability, natural cycles, drought, flood, acts of God. that is what Texans know. Texans know that we're still in drought conditions, even now. Texans know that we've seen crop losses in fields that look like this in recent years. Texans know that many of our reservoirs look like this, but Texans also know that there was the Dust Bowl. Where I live was the center of the Dust Bowl in the 1930s, and there was also a drought in the 50s, and there was also a drought in the 80s. And their parents, their grandparents, and their great-grandparents lived through these droughts. So Texans know there's these natural cycles. So in order to connect with Texans on the issue of climate change, we have to start by talking about natural cycles. And then we have to say, you know what, we're used to coping with rain patterns that look like this. We're used to wet years and dry years. And everybody's nodding along at this point like, oh, she gets it. She knows there's natural cycles. But here's the problem. We assume it's all going to average out over the long term. What if that assumption is no longer true? What if our climate is changing, making our droughts more severe? So we still get the same number of droughts, but when they come, they last longer and they're stronger. And then everybody starts thinking, oh my goodness, you know, this last drought was longer than before, and it was much stronger, and it was more than we expected, and this was not what my granddaddy dealt with back in the 1950s. And now we're all on board and we're all moving forward because we've connected the issue of climate change to what people know and understand, and natural cycles, and also to what they care about, which is their livelihood, because this is an agricultural community. So at this point, we're all on the same page and we're all moving forward. I also spend a lot of time talking to Christian groups. I do not call myself a climate evangelist because I think that's good news, and I feel like I don't have a lot of good news to spread. I feel a bit more like Cassandra than I do like an evangelist. But when I talk to people, you know, anything from you know, a Christian seminary in Vancouver, which is where I just was last month, to a church group here in Texas, when I talk to people, I'm up against another misconception. And that misconception is that global warming is being presented as an alternate religion, one where you worship the earth rather than God, and Al Gore is your high priest. And this is a very real misconception. So when I talk to people, I have to start by talking about how the greatest gift that we as Christians receive from God is God's Son. But have you ever thought about how the second greatest gift we received is this planet that gives us our physical life? And so then people are like, oh, the planet as a gift from God. That's different. And then you can talk about how with climate change, this is a quote, by the way, from the U.S. President's science advisor, who's a scientist, but I love this quote because he uses a word that scientists don't often use. He says, we have three choices with climate change. We can reduce our emissions, we can prepare for a very different future, and we can suffer. And now suffering is a Christian word. Suffering is a word that Christians are familiar with. So then you can go on to show how, as Christians, we're told to love others and care for our neighbors. And when we look around the world, we see that the countries who will be feeling the greatest impacts from climate change are the countries where people do not have the resources to adapt, and the countries where many faith groups and many Christian churches are already supporting organizations like World Vision or Compassion International or Food for the Hungry to care for people in those places. So at this point, everybody, again, is tracking because we've connected the issue of climate change to something that people already care about. Counteracting this idea where often people feel like you have to develop new green values to care about climate change. You have to turn into a tree hugger somehow. And although in Canada we have lots of trees, down in Texas there are no trees, and so there are no trees to hug. So it's very hard to have tree huggers in Texas. And then we have to go on and talk about the nitty-gritty, the fact that the choices that we make today will determine our future. We're going to see a lot greater and faster change if we continue depending on our old, dirty sources of energy. We're going to see a slower and more adaptable change if we can transition to alternative sources of energy by putting a real price on carbon. So this is now we're getting to our message when we've got whoever it is tracking with us. And then lastly, I think it's so important to motivate with positive emotions rather than negative ones, because fear is a good short-term motivator, but long-term it just paralyzes us, and we don't want people to be paralyzed. We want people to be moving forward. That's why it's so important to provide tangible steps to action. So I always tell people say, well, what can I do? I say, use a carbon calculator to figure out what your footprint is. I don't know if you should eat less meat, if you should replace your light bulbs, if you should consider, buying a house somewhere where you can walk or take the TTC to work. I don't know what it is that you can do best, but if you fill out a carbon calculator, you can figure that out and do something. And then, of course, I always tell people to join Citizens Climate Lobby so that we can tell our elected officials to do something about this problem. But at the same time, it's so important to have solutions that everybody can get on board with. And this is a funny article that came out last month. And the reason why I think it's funny is because they asked, is the sky blue? And they got the answer, yes, it is blue. But it's good to, it's good to have scientific published studies saying this. It said, in the case of climate change, they found that conservatives were especially skeptical of the science. And they found that what causes the big difference was not aversion to the science, but aversion to the solutions. Because the solutions provide a conflict between specific ideology that tends to be associated with more conservative factions of not just the US, but these days Canada too, and the most popularly discussed solutions. So that, I think, in a nutshell, is the power of CCL, is that CCL is not about just telling people there's a problem. CCL is about saying we have a solution too. And that is so important. It's not just about economic solutions, though. It's also about cool solutions, like this village in the Netherlands that if sea level goes up 3 feet, well, what do? They buy 3 feet of anchor chain. That's their climate change adaptation, and who wouldn't want to live in one of these houses? Here in Texas, we're seeing our oil rigs being replaced by shiny white wind turbines. Wind supplied 38% of Texas's electricity for a week in March and again in April. We're seeing things that we can get excited about and we can get behind. Simple things like replacing our light bulbs with LEDs save each of us about $30 over the lifetime of the bulb. And in Canada, if every household replaced just one light bulb, one standard old-fashioned light bulb with a new LED, that would be equivalent to taking almost 100,000 cars off the road. And that's a big change that people can do. So the bottom line is, it's not about fear, it's not about guilt, it's not about punishment. It's about building a better future, and building that future not just for our kids, but for others as well. And that's how I think we can talk to people about climate change. All right. Questions? If it's possible to get questions. There we go. I can't see people anymore. I can only see the podium. I don't know if you're able to put the camera back on the other way.
I was hoping you could give us the reference for that study you said about the aversion being based on the aversion to solutions being drives the ideological.
Sorry, were you asking for a reference for that study about how it's important to tell people about solutions that they can agree with? Was that it?
One that I wrote down is aversion to solutions is what drives the ideological climate change by conservatives.
Okay. That is a study that just came out in the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology. It just came out in November, so actually this month, not last month. So in the November Journal of Personality and Social Psychology by Campbell and Kay. And it's called Solution Aversion.
Next question. Thank you so much, Katharine, for doing this. This is great. I have a question. Sometimes when I speak to Christians, they'll say something like, God won't let us destroy ourselves. I'm just wondering how you would respond to that.
That's a very common question we get. You know, how could you think that humans, puny little humans, could be so powerful as to affect something as big as this planet, and how could God let something happen? And the answer to that is actually quite easy. Just look around us in the world today. Bad things happen all the time as a consequence of the decisions that we make. We humans have the ability to make our own decisions. We have free will. And so we use that free will, hopefully often in good ways, but also in bad ways too. Somebody drinks too much. They get behind the wheel of the car. They mow down an innocent bystander, perhaps a mother or a child. What is that? It's the consequence of a bad decision. And so what climate change is simply the consequence of a decision that we didn't know was bad back in the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. In fact, the Industrial Revolution itself was a good thing. And I think that's often very disarming to tell people that, because they often think, well, you know, we climate change people think that we should all be living in mud huts, you know, with no running water and no electricity and none of the conveniences of modern life. So I think it's important to emphasize that the Industrial Revolution brought us many, many good things. In fact, we wouldn't be here today talking like this if it wasn't for the Industrial Revolution. But we didn't know back then that putting all of this extra carbon into the atmosphere disrupts the natural balance. And that is why we have this problem today. So it's basically free will versus predestination. Now, if you get a hardcore predestination person, that argument will not work. But I found a very strong correlation between people who believe that God is in control of every single little tiny thing, so you can never make any decisions. You find a very high correlation between them and people who cannot be swayed by any information on climate change, even if an angel with flaming tablets of stone appeared in front of them saying climate change is real.
Hi there, and thank you so much. I am so proud of you because you're a Canadian and because of the work you do. Now, there was a documentary that you were in, and the title escapes me, but it was awesome. And if people in the room haven't seen it yet, I think
Okay, I can see on, oh, there we go. He's turning me around. Okay. You were asking, I think, about the Years of Living Dangerously. The Years of Living Dangerously was a documentary that came out this April and May, and it aired on Showtime, but you can see the first episode for free, which is one of the episodes I was in, on YouTube, and you can buy the whole series on Amazon or on iTunes. And the Years of Living Dangerously even won an Emmy for Best Documentary this September. So it was really it was really a fun program. And what I love about that is it does a great job of bringing the issue home, of talking to people who say, well, why should I care about this issue? It only matters to the polar bears. Well, this was not about polar bears. This was about people living in Texas, people living in Syria, people living in Arizona and Colorado and Florida and all over the world, and how climate change is affecting them. So if you haven't seen Years of Dangerously, definitely check it out.
Hi, Katharine. My name is Katharine Hayhoe, and I work with an organization here in Canada called Citizens for Total Justice. And I spend a lot of time in church basements talking to faith communities about how they can respond to climate change, how they can get involved in advocacy. And I just wanted to a question that I just wanted to say. I mean, it's really good to be part of today's event. It's a real privilege to hear from you, and also a lot of things that I think will be helpful for me personally as I go forward in a lot of faith issues and looking at how we move forward. Thank you.
Thank you.
I am here. I work for an organization called the base mandate is to get deep science and climate change out to the public in understandable language. So my question for you is about the skeptics and deniers. And I got from your presentation that you have to understand your audience as well. But I'm just curious to know what your strategy is, because those groups can be incredibly powerful. And I just appreciate you talking a little bit more about that.
Sure. I would say that most of the people I talk to on a regular basis would consider themselves to be doubtful or disengaged about the issue of climate change. But there are definitely a small but extremely vocal minority who are what the Six Americas very kindly calls dismissive, and what I would call unconvincible. So when I talk to people, my goal is to definitely provide answers to the questions people have. So that's why websites like Skeptical Science which is run by a colleague of mine in Australia, is so important because it provides scientific responses to every "but what about" question. So, you know, but I heard Arctic sea ice was recovering, and I heard there was more polar bears, or I heard global warming stopped, or I heard da-da-da-da. So when you're talking to people who are doubtful, and when there's dismissive people around, those people are very well informed about climate change, better than people in the middle. But they're very well informed from the perspective of being stuffed full of false information and false sound bites. And, you know, I mean, I often feel like in Canada this isn't as common. So I was giving a presentation a year and a half ago at a camp in Ontario, which had an environmental studies program. And so I thought to myself, oh, well, at this camp, it was a family camp, so I was presenting to the adults. I thought to myself, okay, well, first of all, I'm in Canada, and second of all, it's a camp with an environmental science program, so I don't have to talk about these but whatabouts. I don't have to talk about how we know it's not a natural cycle, or how we know it's not the sun, or why we think humans are causing climate change. I thought to myself, I don't have to talk about this because there's surely not going to be anybody here. Well, it turns out that I had one of the most strident, unconvincible people in that audience, in that camp in Ontario that I'd ever had in my life. So that was a lesson to me that whatever group we're in, there will be people who have false information about climate change. And even though I don't think that we can convince people who are unconvincible, I think what we have to do is we have to show everybody around who is listening that we have answers and that their points are not valid, and you cannot use that as an excuse for continuing to ignore this issue. So one of the best comments I ever got after a presentation was I got somebody coming up to me afterwards and they said, you know, I didn't used to think this whole global warming thing was real, but you addressed every reason that I had to think it wasn't real. So at this point, either I have to agree with you or I have to come up with some new reasons because I can't use the old ones anymore. And I thought to myself, that is exactly in life, is to get people to that point. And I would categorize that person as a doubtful person who is considering moving into the cautious category. So again, when you have a very strident person who's pulling out all these mythical sound bites, so to speak, about climate change, your goal is not to convince that person or even to beat them down, because it's kind of like a whack-a-mole game at the fair, you know, where you hit the mole on the head with a hammer and another one pops up. Our goal is not to win the whack-a-mole game. Our goal is just to show that we have an answer to every mole that they pop up, so that everybody else around us who is listening recognizes who's making sense and who isn't.
Hi, Katharine. Thanks so much. My name's Tom. I had a number of meetings with conservatives, both traveling to the CCL conference in BC and Swansea Conservative, and here in Ottawa, in my constituency. I really love the premise of connecting with people and so on, but that's a lot easier than obviously you're much more skilled than I am. So when the conservatives here, capital C and small c, conservatives have repeated so often the phrase job-killing carbon tax and extreme, anyway, the radical and extreme label is affixed to anyone who seems to do darn. How can we get past that threshold to get to the common values thing? Please.
That is so tough. I mean, you know, it has just been shocking to me, and it probably has been shocking to you too, just to see how polarized we've started to become in Canada in recent years, in the scientific community and in all kinds of environmental issues. What I hear when I hear, for example, when I hear the Prime Minister talking about issues related to climate and energy and the environment, and what I hear often when I hear other conservatives speaking about it is it's often presented as an issue of the economy or. So in other words, on one side we have the economy, and on the other side we have all these kind of bleeding heart issues, like climate change and the environment and all that. And so I think that is a straw man argument. And whenever I've been on CBC a couple times in the last few months, and whenever I am, they usually pull out something like that. And I try to say, look, it's not the economy or the environment. It is brief, short-term economic gain for a limited number of people versus significant long-term gain for Canada as a whole with a healthy environment to live in, which we all need for the sake of our own health. So, you know you're preaching to the choir when you get applause for that. But I think that economic arguments are very important. And so in Canada, maybe even more than in the States, when I was talking about those moles that we have to be prepared to whack with the hammer, I think the economic moles are even more important. We have to have information on how quickly the renewable energy industry is growing, on how quickly prices are dropping, on how China is the world leader in wind, and the second in solar. The United States is number 2 in wind and number 5 in solar. Germany's number 1. Canada's not even on that list. How the economy is changing and we are lagging behind because we are clinging to the security blanket of fossil fuels when the rest of the world is leaving us behind. And so economically, from the perspective, first of all, of the new clean energy economy, and also from the perspective of climate damages, economically, there are very strong arguments to be made, and that's why there's this risky business report that came out in the spring. It was co-authored by Hank Paulson, who used to be the Secretary of the Treasury in the U.S., and Mayor Bloomberg, who was the mayor of New York and a Republican. So when you have fiscally conservative people issuing reports about climate change, calling it risky business, these are the types of things that we need to be using to talk to people who care about the economy. Because the myth is that you don't care about the economy, but the reality is we all care about the economy. We all want a job. We all want our kids to get jobs. We all want to be able to have a good lifestyle. So our values that we connect on are the economy. Yes, I want a good economy. You want a good economy. Let me talk to you about how climate change is affecting the health of our economy, and let me talk to you about how we are missing the boat on the transition to the new economy, where China is leaving everybody in the dust.
Katharine, thank you very, very, very much. I can't begin to tell you how I appreciate it and enjoy listening to you, and I hope the whole audience here has appreciated it as well. So thank you very, very much for the conference. In case you can't see it, you're getting a standing ovation here.
I can see. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much, and keep up the great work.